pushing record as we're recording this. Hi everybody, good evening. Thanks so much for joining this LIANZA webinar on early literacy story times and training. So we've got two presenters tonight. They both work at Christchurch City Libraries and they're going to tell you more about themselves, but I really want to welcome Alicia, Harbison-Price and Emma Stilwell this evening. They're going to be sharing some work that each of them have done for their master's degrees. Apparently Harbison-Price, you quote 2016 and Stilwell 2021. So one is building, I understand, Emma, your research is building on the earlier research that Alicia did. And so I'd like to hand over to you and we'll get underway with the karakia this evening.
Yeah, so I'll just start the screen share and we'll do our karakia. Right, make that bigger. Slideshow. All right, do you want to start?
Okay.
Yeah. Whakataka te hau ki te uru. Whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta. Kia mā taratara ki tai. He hi aki ana te ata kura. He tio, he huka, he hohu, ti he moriora. All right. So we'll just sort of launch into it. So because our research reports are quite long, we've tried to condense as much as possible into like a 40-minute time span. And we're really excited. So many people have taken time out of their evening to attend. So basically here, these are the main talking points we'll be covering. So thinking about reflecting on those throughout the talk. So mostly, early literacy skills are important for developing literacy. Libraries can support literacy development through story times. Early literacy story times can support library and council goals. Staff require training to successfully deliver early literacy story times. And New Zealand libraries can share training programs and draw on international research. So to begin with, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with early literacy. Maybe it's why you're here. So early literacy is a theory of literacy development. It's about the skills, competencies, and attitudes that children acquire before beginning to read. It is not about teaching children to read and write. It's about providing the skills which will help them get there when they enter more formal education. So what are the early literacy skills? So these have been developed by the USA's National Institute of Children's Health and Development. So this is the second edition. The first edition of skills are slightly different, and that's what I use when doing my research. So we've got phonological awareness, which is basically when letters combine to make sound. So a single O is an O sound, two O's is an U sound. And it's about playing with rhymes and syllables. The second skill is print conventions and awareness, and that's basically just knowing how to handle a book. And you'll see toddlers do that all the time. They'll pick up a book and just practice opening it and turning the pages and holding it the right way and reading from the right direction. Letter knowledge is just knowing that a capital letter and a lowercase letter are the same thing and knowing that they make a sound. Vocabulary is what a lot of young children develop quite quickly as they begin speaking, and it's just knowing different words for different meanings, different things, and that all helps them build an understanding of the world. The final skill is background knowledge, and background knowledge is, it accompanies in the old set what was called print motivation, which is how children want to engage with text, children seek out text and want to read it and understand it. It encompasses narrative skills, so that's children knowing that a story has a beginning, middle, and end, that something happens after something else happens. But it's also about just all the knowledge that a child will have, all the experiences, cultural experiences, which will bring them to understanding how the world works. So why are early literacy skills important? So we know from lots of studies, especially longitudinal studies, that children who lack early literacy skills will continue to lack literacy skills in their first year of school. Letter knowledge and phonological awareness are the biggest indicators of that. They're the most important skills to have because they form decoding. If you ever work with young children who are learning to read, you will notice that they'll break up words, so skip peen, they'll sound out chunks of letters, And those are all skills that we can start developing through early literacy. So I've got below, we'll send out these slides to bits of research, to studies done in New Zealand around identifying what skills children need to prepare for school. So we know that children need these skills. So how do they learn them? And the research is indicating that children primarily develop these skills from interactions with parents and caregivers, adults in their lives. That's either their direct family or people who are caring for them full time. That could be like a family relative or like, you know, a kindergarten or early education centre. And there's been quite a bit of study on this. The biggest one I quite enjoyed was Stilwell et al. And they found that children whose parents started reading to them at an early age showed better performance on phonological awareness and name writing, like these kids can write their names out. And there's also a positive correlation between the number of books in the family's home and how often the children were read to and how many times the children were told with their parents how to recognise letters. But Westerfeld found that kindergarten teachers weren't really directly targeting these things, and that they might need to be providing more activities to children, especially for children who did not have rich literacy environments at home. And that's sort of where the whole, where libraries have come in, because we can support that. And then at the bottom is another piece of research by Q Shang, and that was about the New Zealand early education curriculum, Te Whariki, and it found that it's a very holistic curriculum and there wasn't a lot of direct like activities or ideas for educators or caregivers to be teaching children literacy skills. So where do we fit in? And this is a big part of what Emma and I's research has been, and we've found all the research indicates that public libraries are in a really great position to be supporting the development of early literacy in their communities. We are present in a wide range of communities, so no matter the socioeconomic demographic of those areas, like could be a library there. We are inclusive, we pride ourselves on being really welcoming to all people, and most importantly, we are free. Cost is a really big barrier to families to creating rich home literacy environments. Because children, their reading skills grow so quickly, families can't keep up with buying those materials. That's where libraries can fill that gap. And what's also great is that we also have a wide range of other resources that can support early literacy. So that's picture books, musical CDs, books containing rhymes. And most importantly, libraries are just generally very passionate about supporting literacy in the community. And many of us will have vision statements or goals or strategic outcomes related to supporting literacy in the community we're in. And this is just a couple of examples of some research. And most of these ones are showing how libraries around the world are using early literacy programs and the positive impacts they've been having on their communities. Example one, such one is the Every Child Ready to Read. That's a framework endorsed by the American Library Association. That's their best practice. There's quite a few books written about creating story times using this framework. It's also endorsed in Australia. And basically, so there's a lot of libraries where the librarians are demonstrating early literacy skills and are modelling to the caregivers how to support that development at home. What can you keep doing at home to keep your child reading? But we have to know, does it work? And there have been some more recent studies which are really exciting, which have observed story times to see what kind of behaviours were happening with the children during the story time, and interviewing parents to see what they did at home. And I found that when a librarian provides early literacy content in the story time, corresponding behaviour is observed in the children. But for librarians to do this, they have to have the appropriate training. They have to be intentionally developing these story times with this in mind. And they have to have the confidence and skills to be modelling and speaking to the parents about why we're doing this. And the biggest way that that staff can have these skills is through training, and that's mostly what Emma and I's research has been about, is talking to people about what kind of training have you received to support your storytime practices. This is the research that Goldine and Sugar did before our research, and Goldine was our supervisor, so we built a lot upon what she had done in the past. And in interviews and observations of some New Zealand librarians delivering story times, they found that print motivation was a primary focus. And that's just getting children to love reading, getting children to come into the library, providing appearance of books to take home with their children. Other early literacy skills, such as the phonological awareness and the letter awareness, was not that well observed. She also found that in interviews of staff, they were really wary towards including educational elements. They did not want to be seen as an educator. And also, none of the staff that they interviewed reported using Te Whariki in their storytime development. But we're probably all including early literacy skills in our story times, even if we don't have an underlying understanding of the theory that supports our practice. So this sort of then leads into my research. Now we've got the little introduction out of the way. Emma, has there been any questions at all? No, is everyone feeling good? Oh, yeah, sorry. If you have questions, feel free to chuck some questions in the chat. Emma is sitting next to me and she can nudge me and say, you can explain a bit more. I know I'm talking very fast, so if I get nervous. Right, so my research. I did my research in November 2017. I interviewed 9 library staff from across 5 different library networks in New Zealand. And the main points of the discussion was around the aims of their story times, the training they received, and their role in the development of early literacy skills. I did mine as a series of interviews, so what I set out to do was quite different from what I received. Because when you're interviewing people, you never know where that conversation will go. The main thing that I found is that librarians reported the aim of their story times was to support the love of reading. And that's what Anne Goldine and her fellows found as well. And the staff were using story times to encourage children to be interested in books, to engage with the books, and to enjoy being read to. The children would want to be read to. I also found when my interviewees were talking about the aims of their story times, they fell on a spectrum between story times being for recreation and story times being education. And so some people felt that story time was simply a recreational activity for whānau, that people could just come into the library to spend time and bond with their children and to make it part of their lifestyle. Whereas some other librarians reported seeing their story time as a way to educate families. But all interviews agree that a story time really needs to be enjoyable. It needs to be enjoyable, entertaining, engaging, and that's a really cool aspect of them. So like Anne Goldine, I found that a lot of librarians are wary of including educational elements. This is a really prominent quote I've got. The one interviewee who was in actually a management position reported that they rejected story time as being anything other than recreational. As I said, they said, we're not here to be a preschool teacher. We're not here to be a primary school teacher. Parents will ask me for things, but it's just not my job. And staff in the same network echoed the same opinion. They felt that by moving away from recreation, like we're adding too much pressure, they were worried that they would make parents anxious, that they're not doing a good enough job with their children, or create anxiety about the parents' own literacy. And it can be quite big when you're dealing with families where English is a second language, or where education is lower in that area. So family could be feeling anxious about literacy in general. However, other staff saw story times as more as educational. They were fun, but it was also an educational opportunity. And they didn't believe that being educational compromised their story times. They were still fun, they were still playful. And they also described doing things during their story times like choosing books which would improve their vocabulary, to introduce new topics to them. They reported giving advice to caregivers about which books to choose for their young children. And one librarian I interviewed, when they were reporting back on their aims, matched all their aims to their library strategic plan. So we can see when you're just talking to people one-on-one, like their personal aims for story times, that can originate from their own values or they're echoing the values of their organisation. Those beliefs have a significant impact on the type of story time being delivered and what the families are receiving. I asked staff what they felt their role was in early literacy development. The people who reported having an educational aspect, they placed their role in a professional context. They would frequently describe it as a professional, I do this. As part of being a professional, I do this. And they, as I said, they did activities that like readers advisory, recommending books, developing the print motivation, etc. And the implication here is that these staff members viewed being a professional librarian as also being an educator. They're the same thing. They're not different things. Being a librarian was being an educator. Whereas, as we saw from the quote before, staff with a more recreational focus placed their role solely in terms of print motivation. Their focus solely was to get people coming into the library to love reading. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you read my report, there's some, in my literature review, I believe I quoted a report which suggested that children who have a high interest in reading, who have that love of reading can protect them from elements such as a low home literacy environment or from learning disabilities. They're more willing to overcome challenges because they love being read to. So print motivation, the love of reading, is still really important. It's a skill I don't want to take away from that. But whether we like it or not, we are quite involved in early childhood education. Many of my interviewees reported being visiting early childhood education centres to deliver story times at their request. Their story times were attended by children from local early education centres. So these were kindergartens, playgroups, preschools, the whole variety. And I also interviewed someone who worked as a mobile librarian. They drove a bus around rural areas. And that too meant they were coming into contact with preschools. They were the sole, I guess, connection between these isolated communities and library materials. So yeah, whether like or not we are involved in education, might not be implicit, but I believe so that by embedding early literacy practices in a fun and engaging program like a story time, we can align ourselves with play-based values. Te Whariki is all about play-based values, and I think story times fit quite nicely into that. And many of the librarians in my study reported that story times can be fun and educational, but training is the biggest factor of how we can get to that educational element and kind of smooth out the transition, because it can be quite awkward trying to keep a story time fun and keeping that flow going, and then telling someone why you're reading in this way or why drawing letters or whatever is important. What I found regarding training, and I'm going to go a little over it because Emma's goes way in more detail. It's really good. Keep hyped. I asked participants about the training they received prior to delivering their story time, and many of them were mentored by a peer in their network, and that would involve co-hosting with them, being observed by them, and having their practice supported by that peer. And Emma found similar things, and she'll go into it. I also asked staff about any training they undertook after starting story times. And what I found is some really interesting insights, especially I guess maybe for managers, to think about why are my staff not signing up for things? What kind of training do they actually want? Many of them attended conferences and workshops provided by LIANZA or other education agencies such as Sports NZ. They would also bring in visiting guests. So like Susan Dodd would come around New Zealand and do that, or they would get a professional storyteller in to help them improve that But most of their the training they undertook was about techniques and props and tools rather than early literacy development. But the training that they did undertake was positively received. People really enjoyed going to training and loved having an opportunity to go into training. It gave them confidence to try new techniques and encouraged them to reflect on their storytime aims. So a lot of them reported asking themselves, why am I doing this? Like, what's this for? And when the storytime training did include an early literacy content, staff felt like that backed up their aims for their storytime. So if a staff member had an aim of, or an organisation had an aim of storytimes are about improving literacy, and then they were presented with early literacy training, they're like, oh yeah, this backs me up. This is, it's all evidence-based, essentially. But some staff reported not applying to events. And this was really common in the staff members I interviewed who had been at the organisation for like 5 to 10 years. They didn't want to attend events. They felt that they had their fair share. They didn't want to take funding opportunities away from staff who had been in the organisation for less. They didn't want to be seen, I guess, maybe even as greedy by always going to the conference each year. And staff also described not being able to observe other people's story times. So within one network, 2 branches might have their story times at the exact same time, which means both presenters can never observe each other. In small, more geographically isolated branches, staff could not travel from their network to another library network to observe their story times. So the problem I saw identified here is that when libraries rely on face-to-face peer mentoring and external providers to train staff in storytime practice, the training can be negatively impacted by funding, by staffing levels, and also the beliefs and values of the staff delivering the mentoring. Because if you have a staff member doing mentoring and their values don't line up with your organisation, the values of their trainees are going to be the same. Well, most usually are the same. That's just something to think on. I did ask about strategic plans, and what I found was I interviewed 5 library networks. 2 of them had a standalone strategic plan, 2 featured in their council strategic plan, and 1 was in the process of developing a new one. And this was just something I was kind of curious about. I just was interested in how their storytime aims align with the overall values of the organisation. And I found that where the strategic plan lacked specific outcomes or goals related to literacy, the staff similarly just struggled to identify their library's vision and relate it to their storytimes. And some of the interviewees could not recall their library's vision statement at all. And for the ones who had prepared for the interview, I did some of the interviews by email, they actually admitted they'd struggled to locate their strategic plan. They didn't know where to find it. There was some staff who had a standalone plan and it had no specific goal for children's literacy. So they were referring to a separate policy document about the library's role as an educational institution and how it supported lifelong learning. And these were the staff who were more likely to be on the educational end of that storytime spectrum. But as I said, this is definitely an area that could do with a bit more research. It'll be interesting to hear from people in the chat about their strategic plans and how they incorporate them into their training. I just wanted to know if the storytimes, are our storytimes actually supporting the library's vision? Are we meeting any goals or outcomes, however vague they might be? And so this sort of comes up to my last slide. And so my research and the findings of Anne Golding's research group indicates that librarians frequently develop storytimes focused solely on print motivation, about fostering that love of reading. But this might not be enough to support a strategic goal like literacy and lifelong learning in the community. And that's especially the case if we are relying on evaluating storytime solely on foot count, like attendance. And that's a lot of what the staff I interviewed reported doing. So I believe, based on my research, that if Storytimes focus on early literacy development, we can more definitively argue that Storytimes are supporting the development of literacy in the community, and there is research to back this up. So that's me. So I've got my, so because my research was published 4 years ago, you can download it from Victoria University's research archive. Also got my email address there, so I'm more than happy to receive any questions. So yeah, should we? Do everyone have any questions about your research? Yeah, does anyone have any questions? I feel like I really jumped through that quite quickly. Open the chat.
I mean, you could even unmute yourselves if you want to actually speak.
Yeah. People probably want to hear someone else's voice. I don't mind. Oh, thanks, Hannah.
If not, I can jump into mine and we'll have more time afterwards. I'm going to force you to talk because I've got breakout groups. So yeah.
I had a question. I was really interested in what you said about the connecting, knowing what your strategic plan is and what your goals are, and therefore knowing what it is that you're wanting to actually deliver in terms of story times. And you said about the evaluation often being via sort of footprint.
Yeah.
Did you see or did you hear any other ways that people were evaluating their story times, or do you have any suggestions about
the other way
data that could be collected?
When I asked people how they evaluated their story times as like a sort of brief discussion point, most of them just said, oh, based on numbers, based on how many people come. And then other things was just immediate feedback from attendees. So if attendees said thank you at the end or seemed happy with it, that was primarily around it. But I'm sure a lot of people can agree that qualitative evaluation in libraries is really difficult. And that's something I think's been an internship project here in our network, is how do you actually gauge how people feel about it? It is really difficult, and that's why I sort of thought, oh, well, if we have this evidence-based practice, then we can just know for sure that there is a value here at the end of it. But we should be doing other surveys and questioning of attendees to find out. There has been a few other things done around evaluation in libraries, but it's very hard. Oh,
so that one, I have a question about whether there was peer mentoring. Other than peer mentoring conferences, were there any other established training programs? I will get into that next, I promise.
Yeah.
A short answer is yes, but only if you're in a big city.
Yeah. And so yeah, I found that lockdown was a great opportunity to see how others present their programs as lots been online. And I'm sure that will lead up to Emma's recommendation at the end of it about how we can be using tools like this to break down the distance and better share. Yeah.
Should I get started?
My name's Nicola.
Oh, yes, Nicola.
My name's Nicola. I'm from Selwyn Libraries. I've just recently completed the Better Start to Literacy approach, which was an online through Canterbury University. So I've been evaluating my story times by doing reflective feedback.
Oh, cool. How does that work?
So that's because I can't gauge what the value of my changes in story time have been. So I sort of do a reflective feedback and just I looked at confidence in the child as one of the things. So I sort of made a small note of what the children's confidence was like at the beginning of the 6 weeks, that I changed things around, and then the difference at the end of the 6 weeks.
Yeah, that's a really cool thing to do. And I guess that means that you can track to see, are the children becoming more vocal? Can they identify more sounds and letters?
Yeah.
So I think that's a really cool way to think about it. And the Better Start program that University of Canterbury has started, that's really cool actually. I think, does that course cost to do?
No, well, the course I done was the free online one, so I don't get the certificate to say, yay, I've completed it. But it was a free online through the Harvard platform, education platform. Yeah.
What I sort of found is that funding is always going to be an obstacle to people getting training. So the more stuff that I think we can offer for free, the more people can take part of it, and it's not going to be that fear that you're taking away from other people in your network, because we don't, I think librarians are very modestly humble people. We don't want to take advantage of others. I think there's some people it's like, yeah, I know what I want, I'm going to do it, but
And we chose a profession where we give stuff away for free. I don't think
Thank
we're
you.
very self-motivated.
yeah.
Does anyone else have anything they want to say, or should I start my talk? I'm going to assume that we'll have more time for questions afterwards anyway. Yeah, okay, let's swap seats.
Cool. I'll share the new PowerPoint. Looks very similar to the other PowerPoint. There you go. Emma, step swap.
Okay. Oh, how do I actually can I get this out of the way?
I couldn't. I use this big thing here.
Oh, of course. Man, I feel like my mum.
Just I'm not on my laptop. Yeah.
Nope, it's resuming the old slideshow. Great fun. Come on, and then slideshow.
There you go.
Wow, is that what it feels like to be not a millennial? Yeah. My research was focused, I built on Alicia's, I focused on the training side of Storytimes. However, it's not available yet through the Victoria Library website because I only finished it in February. It has been like marked and I've gotten like my big stamp of approval. If you want to read the full version, it's 50 pages. I don't think it's too poorly written. You can just email me and I will send you a PDF. So basically, my main question was like, what training do librarians get? So specifically, when we're talking about story times, what actions that we could do during story times, like picking a rhyming story or pointing at the words as we read, those kind of actions that support our audience's literacy development, what of those ones are we being trained to do, and how? And I want to thank all of you who did contribute to this research, because I recognize the odd name in the chat box. So I'm starting with my finish points. So I really want these to be the takeaways that you get. So I don't want them to be skipped. So the first point is that my results align really well with Alicia's and also with the other research done in New Zealand. The same skills that are being missed in training. So what Anne Goulding with her observations and Alicia with the interviews, those same patterns of what's being covered or not covered comes up in training. And that suggests that training is linked with how librarians practice professionally. Now, that's not to say that training causes it. I don't know if the people who, we've developed these attitudes as a profession and we're developing the trainings, it could go either way. Most training is done by observing others, and co-presenting with others, and this technique reinforces existing practices, whether they're kind of the best practice at the moment or not. And that's basically that. And then bigger libraries are already offering really comprehensive training, and that kind of suggests resourcing matters. And by resources, I mean having a bigger budget, having more staff, so there's like an economy of scale when you're creating training. Being more likely to have staff who are dedicated children's services or professional development focused librarians. The largest libraries that participated all had written records of their training, and that increases the likelihood of each staff member receiving a consistent body of knowledge. And then their records also kind of seem to correlate with the comprehensiveness of training, but I'll talk about that in a bit. So how did I get here? Going back to the very beginning, I started in libraries about 6 years ago, and I pretty much immediately started delivering preschool programs. I felt like I knew what I was doing. Children seemed to really enjoy my sessions. I got positive feedback from parents. And then I moved to Canada, and they wouldn't even let me do any preschool programming until I'd been through their, approved program. And I thought, well, that seems a bit silly, but okay, sure. And I went and did their program and realized that I did not know nearly as much as I thought I did. I knew that I had to deliver like a fun story time, but that was kind of it. It was fun. I'd been missing all the little things that you can do to make it a richer learning experience for children and their parents. So when I started my master's research, I wanted to see if my experience was just that, my experience and like a nice anecdote, or if it was reflective of something broader in the profession in New Zealand. So I did my literature review and I found, like Alicia, a ton of research in support of early literacy and story times. In fact, I found even more than Alicia because there's been some really great comprehensive studies published in the last 3 years that show that direct link between early literacy story times and children being able to demonstrate their early literacy skills. And then of course I looked at the New Zealand research and I didn't find that level of support from librarians. So I kind of, Alicia just talked about it, but Goulding didn't really find anyone talking about letter knowledge or explicitly opposing it because they thought it was too educational. They didn't see librarians doing these actions that would support early literacy development. And then Alicia in her interviews, she just talked about it, some opposition to the more educational aspects. So I was like, but why? We're an Anglophone country, just like all the other ones. Unfortunately, that's too big a question for a master's report, or someone else is welcome to delve into it in the future. So my questions were a little bit narrower. I focused in just on what are we getting in training. So what early literacy related professional development do staff who deliver storytime programming in New Zealand receive in their workplace? Sorry, super wordy. It's the nature of academic questions. What factors impact on the early literacy related content of professional development? And how does the early literacy related content in our trainings compare with the kind of evidence-based principles that we're seeing overseas? So my plan was to collect all the training documents from libraries across New Zealand, do content analysis on them, and then supplement with a survey to see how reliable those documents were. And in reality, libraries don't have documentation on what they do in their storytime training. So I was very lucky. I had a lot of survey participants. I used quantitative analysis and I supplemented the quantitative analysis with the descriptions of the documents and use those documents to sort of observe whether people's survey responses and the documents they were able to provide kind of lined up. Like if you said you have the best storytime training in the world covering absolutely everything, do you also have documents to show that? So I created a list of every single library in New Zealand that does a story time, and it's 49 library systems as of November of last year. I emailed all of them. I had 5 libraries that were able to provide both documentation and did a survey. 26 libraries just gave me a survey. 2 did the documents but didn't have the survey. 3 said they don't have any kind of training and weren't able to provide any information. And 13 libraries never responded at all. But that's still a really great response rate, to be honest. So before I jump into what my results were, I want to have a quick breakout chat so that we're kind of can stretch our voices and not just listen. So that's not going to be long. Introduce yourself, tell people what library you work for, and then what early literacy kind of techniques or what things that you think might support literacy development do you remember being taught to do in your workplace? Anna, are you able to set the breakout groups kind of free?
How many do you want in each group?
Let's say 5 in a group-ish.
So maybe 6.
Sounds great.
Okay, we're just going to do this like boom and see if it works. So you should get something coming up that allows you to do it. We should be able to say how long you want it for.
Let's just do, actually we're doing really well for time. Can we just do 5 minutes?
5 minutes. Okay. So let's see if that works.
Okay. And we jump back to it. So come on, slideshow. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of some of the actions. My survey that I sent out included 50 different actions that you could do in a story time, and they were broken down into what early literacy skill they would support the development of. So say writing children's name on a sign-in sheet is related to print conventions and awareness. Though if you talk about the letters, it could also be letter awareness. Open-ended questions is a background knowledge skill. Animal sounds is for phonological awareness. Explaining words relates to vocabulary. Rhyme and alliteration relate to phonological awareness. Pointing at the words as you read is about sort of text, print conventions and print awareness. Same with environmental text. Using felt or magnet letters, pointing out and naming letters, and choosing alphabet books are all ways to support letter awareness. And then doing a book walk, which is where you look through the pages and look at the pictures and talk a bit about them before you start actually reading the story, supports the development of background knowledge. So you need that to understand this mega graph. This is like my important graph. It has the overview of all my results in one semi-pretty place. So what we have is the inclusion of the rate of inclusion for each early literacy supporting action across all the libraries that participated. So each point on the graph represents the percentage of libraries that covered a particular action during their training. So for example, this big red circle point at the top that 100% of libraries said, yep, we do this, was including songs. So that songs, phonological awareness. Whereas this point right down here at the bottom of letter knowledge is talking about letters in a child's name if you use name tags or a sign-in sheet. So just for a little bit of other understanding of this, the X in the middle of each one, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, possibly not, you can. So each one's got a little X, that's your the median. So like the average in the sense of if you added all the numbers together and divided them, that's that one. Whereas this line through the center just represents like the middle point of it. Like we're either halfway between the two middle points, if it's an odd number or right on even number, odd number, or right on a midpoint. So you can see that the actions that relate to phonological awareness, these orange ones, are by far the ones that are included the most. As are actions around background knowledge. So within background knowledge is that desire to read. And the previous version of the early literacy skills, it was called print motivation. There's this long tail being caused by a single low point, which is the book walk. But on average, the majority of results are in this, are covered by more than half of the libraries in New Zealand. Print conventions, so vocabulary we're doing pretty well on. Print conventions is obviously second to lowest. And then we have letter knowledge. So letter knowledge is being included far less than any other thing, which like Alicia mentioned is also kind of correlates with what her and Anne Goulding both found in their research as well. It's a really important skill to teach though, because it's necessary for children to learn to read, because they need to know that different letters represent different sounds. And our average for it's actually being pulled up a little by this odd point, which I'll go into in a second. So like I said earlier, I can't say whether the training is impacting what Alicia and Anne found, or if the people that Alicia and Anne found represent the values of librarians around New Zealand, and those people are then developing this training, which is missing this key aspect. Now, to that odd point around letter awareness, so I did this graph for all of the skills, but only letter awareness kind of came up with anything interesting. So these are all the actions that I asked about that relate to letter awareness. And our one with the highest rate of inclusion is actually the one that in some ways least directly relates to letter awareness, or is more indirectly related. It could also be considered a vocabulary skill, so people might be including it for that reason rather than for its benefits with teaching letter knowledge. It is the pointing out and naming shapes. So shapes, letters are essentially complicated shapes, right? A big A isn't that different from a triangle. It's just a slightly more complicated thing. Children need to learn what it looks like, that it has a name. So practicing that with the more simple things, shapes, helps them when they need to do it with letters. So I just thought that was interesting. But generally with letter awareness, other than including alphabet books and shapes, less than half of libraries in New Zealand are including other things that could support letter awareness knowledge in children. I also wanted to see what other things might be impacting on training. So I did this kind of graph, and so this one here is, I've removed the scale so it's not too easy to work out which library is which. I'm not going to tell you who participated, but I was wanting to see if there were any trends and whether things like the size of the territorial authority, that's the size of council, the number of branches, the frequency of story times, any other things that might impact on what kind of training staff receive. And nothing was statistically significant. You might kind of be able to imagine a pattern here, but the math says this is random. I also kind of, in a more qualitative approach, looked through the results to see if there were trends, maybe rural, urban divides, certain clusters in the country that were doing well. Nothing, no pattern whatsoever in who does what, with one little exception. I'll jump into that in a sec. So training methods. The results were pretty much as I expected. So observing story times and co-presenting others before going it alone was definitely the most common method. Most libraries used a mix of methods, but those two were kind of like the core, and then some other things might be randomly scattered in, but without any kind of pattern to it. The only thing that I noticed in terms of trends was something I noticed in a more kind of qualitative observational way. The handful of libraries that were using the more formal training techniques, so classroom style lessons and like kind of providing something to read or a video to watch with sort of theoretical information, were also the libraries that had the most comprehensive training, covering all of the early literacy skills and having documents to back up the survey data. There were also libraries that didn't use those formal methods that said they had very comprehensive training. But there were no libraries that were like, we've got all this formal training, but we don't teach much. So there was like that correlation between having planned training and comprehensiveness, which kind of makes sense. If you're going to sit down and create a formal Storytime training resource, you're probably going to do research, you discover some of the many overseas resources, and create training that's based on evidence-based practices. You're more likely to get into that early literacy content than if you were just watching someone else do it, and then doing it yourself a couple of times. So, like I said, the key points I wanted you to get from that: we're missing the same thing in our trainings. We're not teaching how to support print conventions and awareness or letter knowledge. Some libraries have really great training, but most are using a method that doesn't allow for a lot of theoretical knowledge to be conveyed or for staff to build on knowledge past just how to do a story time. Yeah, there are some really comprehensive training resources in public libraries in New Zealand, but they're only available to staff at those large libraries. If I could twist their arm and make them share it all with you, I would. I also want to make clear that, like, as a librarian who I do deliver story times regularly, I don't actually think that like teaching all the early literacy content and how to include it is something you do when you're new to story times. Training isn't like a one and done thing. I think it's something you build upon with your knowledge once you're confident at presenting the stories in front of an audience. Yeah. So we've got 4 minutes. Okay. Let's just jump straight into questions then. That happened so fast. I felt like I barely talked at all. And you're also welcome to like say stuff.
Someone's asked, for further research, what topics would you suggest? You could read both our research reports.
Yeah, both our research reports have that section. So one of the things I found is that because all of the research that we use for early literacy stuff is from the Anglophone world, there's nothing into how we can support the development of phonological awareness or vocabulary in our bilingual culture. So like I know that I can include songs that are in Te Reo Māori and stories that use some Te Reo Māori. I'm not a super confident speaker, but that's something that we don't really know anything about at the moment.
There's storytime reading training available in New Zealand that you think would be useful to do. I think it's about, as you said, getting libraries who have formal training programs to be more transparent with what they've got.
Not necessarily transparent, but
like,
open. So when I was working in Canada, I was working for a city of a million people, but a lot of nearby smaller cities. When a big in-person or online training session was being done, an email would go out to those in the area saying, hey, we've got spare seats. Do you want to send someone? Which I think fits really well with the library's values around sharing.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want us to expand more on it? Like,
does anyone want to say anything?
I was wondering if there was something that LIANZA could do in that space, like
well, I didn't want to shoehorn you into anything in
volunteering.
public, but if you're volunteering, yeah.
I think definitely, like it seemed to me when I was asking staff what training you received, they all reported that basically the only places they had to go outside of their own organisation was LIANZA. They were attending weekend skills, they were attending children's services conferences, or they were attending other conferences. But as I said, like, of course, we're putting lots of work in delivering those conferences, so we do have to charge a fee, but that fee was a barrier for all staff to present it. But I think what even someone, I think, is it Tracy who mentioned in the chat, was that we have started doing stuff online and like putting our own story times online. And there's no reason why bigger libraries couldn't film their story times and put them up on LIANZA as a resource for members.
Assuming they got permission from the publisher, of course.
Yeah. I mean, we have a recording studio.
Yeah, so there are at least, so there are 3 libraries that I saw in my research that have formal training programs with readings, videos, or slide decks with comprehensive notes. They exist. And one of them's even already online in a form that people can access from whatever library they work in. Those libraries just have to volunteer to support the learning in less well-resourced cities.
Can I ask, do you refer to any of the Canadian training resources in your research, Emma?
No, my training resources that I accessed in Canada were practical ones, and my research is very much based on sort of academic, like peer-reviewed literature. The main resource that I've come across in terms of practical information for how to do it well is a book called Step into Storytimes by Siraj Goting and someone else. But yeah, Step into Storytimes. It includes a lot of practical skills that you can really, like, how you would apply that in a story time.
Yeah.
Another question. How much did you guys refer to the what is it? The EECR.
Oh, every child ready to read.
Ready to read, yeah. In the States.
It came up a lot in our literature reviews. It seemed to be forming the framework for story times in America mostly. And it's not something which has transitioned to being used a lot in New Zealand. And I think when like what I was recommending is that these resources doing that, like every child ready to read exists.
It's all online. There's really
online.
Great resources.
I think it's about tailoring it to a New Zealand environment, thinking and then building up confidence around delivering it in our storytime settings. I think in America, the American Library Association, because they've made it their best practice, there's so much wraparound support, where I think here would be starting from ground zero. It's not just the theoretical parts, but also just incorporating it into your story times.
Yeah,
is the next hard stage.
I mean, I used that. I was in a North American library. It's an ALA program, so that was what I was instructed to use. So we were a lot of promoting the daily 5 to parents. So making sure that parents are encouraged to, oh shoot, I should know this off the top of my head, but read, play, write, sing, something else, a bit of that every day, which is a really easy message to get across. And that was one of the changes from the original Every Child Ready to Read to Every Child Ready to Read 2, which is what they're implementing now or using now. As a librarian who used it, I would support it here. I don't think there's anything about it that's too culturally inappropriate for our environment, because it is about broad principles rather than specific actions.
Any more questions? Everyone's tired.
I think that might be.
I wonder if Australia has something like ECR. They have the
State Library of Western Australia has something.
It's the Better Start Reading. It was a program they developed.
I think it's called Better Together.
Oh, they've got a few, I think.
Okay. Yeah, the State Library of Western Australia, if you were to grab my stuff, there's a series of studies that have been done into it to check that it's like legit, and it's very much based on the same principles as ECRR.
You just need our own little version.
Yeah,
first 1,000 days. Yeah, they had I think when I was doing my research, there was a program in which a child, I think 6-week checkup, the family were presented with information about joining their local library, about what kind of books they should be reading to their children. And then when it was evaluated later, they found that people needed more support with like what to do when reading to their children, and how to select books. So that's, I think, where libraries come in, when we about modeling those behaviors to parents, because all well and good telling parents, here's 6 books you should buy for your kid. They need to know why are those books good for my kid,
and how do I use them?
Yeah. I've put our emails in the chat, and I think what we'll probably do is provide LIANZA obviously a slide so they can be sent out to people who registered. But like, we're more than happy to answer any emails or her chat. And so my report's already available online through Victoria University Wellington. You should just be able to Google my full name. There's not many people in New Zealand with my name or any, so it should turn up. And then Emma's, we're not sure when Victoria University will publish that, so you'll need to email Emma to get it, like exclusive access.
Yeah, you've got to be membership only at the moment.
Thanks everyone. Definitely share a recording with people who couldn't make it.
Yes, it will go up on the LIANZA YouTube channel when Jess and I get that done. You certainly gave me lots of food for thought, and people that we need to go talk to about how we can. I've sort of been really aware. My background is early childhood originally.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people who are like that, and I think it's interesting to see how we merge. And I hope people will think about just asking the organisation, like, why are we doing story times? What value do they bring to our communities? Like, are we actually meeting our organisation's goals? That's important when it comes to funding as well. Like, if you want money to go to those conferences, you need to show how does this connect to our council's long-term goals.
Yeah, not just do something because you've always done it, but think about why you're doing it and how you can do it differently. Great. Oh, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for coming this evening. And I'm sure you've got lots to think about, just like I have. And
So we'll do a closing karakia.
Yes, thank you.
Farewell. So, unahia, ki te uru tapanui, kia wātia, kia mama, te te tinana, te wairua, I te tara. Oh goodness. Ara. Champ is hiding it. Kia tina, huie, tai.
Great, thank you.